All right. So we are joined today by Bryan Davis. He runs audience engagement at NBC News Digital. Um, Hi, Bryan. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to have you.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me, Shannon.
So you joined NBC News about 6 or 7 months ago, and prior to that, you spent a few years at the Atlantic, and also working. We worked with you there. So as we kind of go into this, we want to talk about 2020 and the impact it's had on news in general. But feel free to kind of toggle back and forth. We'd love to get your viewpoint from both places.
Yeah, and it's interesting being here talking about the last year and being able to experience what is a pretty interesting news cycle across two different newsrooms. And the pandemic, I think, is an interesting, you know, interesting is not the right word. It's been awful. It's been terrible. For news as an industry, it has been a force that has exacerbated, accelerated a lot of the things that for the last couple of years we've been talking about in the industry. More mobile, more digital. How does that impact revenue diversification? For my team at the Atlantic, we in late 2019, we had gone and relaunched the subscription products at the Atlantic. And that was a project that was many years in the making. And we were very excited, ready to, in earnest, start marketing and promoting that in 2020. Well, March 2020 happens, the lockdown here in New York City happens, the spread across the country, and the journalism that came out of that newsroom at that moment shifted the discourse, the understanding across the world. You had the coronavirus tracking project, you had folks like Ed Young that were writing their just unbelievable, outstanding coverage. And the preparation that we had done for the subscription work, the shift to consumer revenue, all of that was in place to be ready for this outsized interest from consumers in the work that was being produced by the Atlantic's journalism. And so if there was ever a time to be ready, it was that moment when we saw a drastic increase in just total users, but the depth of engagement, the number of people that were coming back for more and more coverage because it was so vital, so critical in those early days. And these are all numbers that are very proudly public, but we had talked in 2019 of trying to hit around 100,000 paying subscribers in our first 2 years. By 9-10 months later, we had 300,000 subscribers. So we had tripled our 2-year mark in just the first 10 months. And that is a testament to the quality of the journalism that was being produced, but it was also the work, the strategy, the preparation that our team did ahead of that moment to be ready for what was just a drastic shift in the type of consumer engagement that we saw. And I think there are a number of other success stories or silver lining stories that came out of certain newsrooms in 2020 and into 2021. But it's hard to balance that where, that is something of an outlier given the number of furloughs and layoffs that had to happen in the last year. And we have today's an interesting day for us. We have a new intern class coming through, and we have 4 folks that are all relatively recent graduates that are joining us to partner on strategy. And so I was preparing notes for this meeting that we're having as an introductory with them later this afternoon. And the top I'm leading with, well, journalism is hard. Just putting that out there, managing expectations. It is a tough industry to be in, and yet it is incredibly rewarding. It's incredibly fulfilling. And I think in the last year, we saw so many different newsrooms and strategy teams pivot and orient themselves around being there for this moment. And so again, going back to this idea of what has changed for us, I think in the industry working in the Atlantic and now being with the team at NBC News Digital, we are seeing a different aspect of that response to the pandemic. And in the last year, when you had not just the pandemic, you had a tumultuous election cycle, you had an overdue and momentous racial reckoning following the murder of George Floyd and nationwide protests and the coverage following that. The engagement in 2020 was so significant. You had so many different stories that were all coming to a head. And so now we're looking at 2021, and there's a lot of commentary right now throughout the publishing, the media coverage around media of declining engagement rates and page views and viewership. Yeah, I think that's something that we are contending with. But of course, you're going to see a shift after one of the most strange upending years in news coverage. And so one of the challenges that we're trying to address now with my new team is how do we think about setting new benchmarks against this outlier year of 2020, and then trying to look ahead to the types of stories that we start to publish. How do we re-engage consumers? And I think that's been a big challenge, question, opportunity for publishing, taking 2020's numbers and the vast growth that we all saw. How do we think about re-engagement? How do we think about sustained behavior over time? It's been something a lot of newsrooms have been talking about, but has really come to a head in the last year. So sort of a long-winded way of talking
No,
about
that was
the
excellent.
different experience.
That was excellent. Thank you. That was a lot of really good insight, and kind of really took us into what you did at Atlantic and how you kind of moved into NBC. So when you went to NBC, it was last spring. So we had about a year of the pandemic already going on. We were past the election, and you were kind of faced or confronted with that challenge. Like, so how do we kind of maintain that engagement that we saw in 2020? Because the years prior to 2020, news and media in general was under a lot of pressure. But now, 2020 came along, and there was just such an unbelievable news cycle, whether it was the pandemic, whether it was George Floyd, whether it was the election. So when you came into NBC, you're looking forward to 2022, 2023, and it's not a subscription model. It's advertising driven. So how are you looking at engagement and audience development differently at NBC than you did at the Atlantic?
It's great for me to come back to a newsroom like this, since I started my career in local media and local magazines where it was advertising based. And though the source of revenue is different, with consumer revenue, you are looking at building a much deeper, more sustained connection. Advertising is still based on the quality of engagement that you get, and some of that is based on scale, but the challenge of re-engagement is still very real for us, because we know that if we go talking about the dollars and cents, the average revenue per user of a returning reader, viewer, listener is exponentially higher than it is for a first-time user, because they tend to be more engaged in their session. They tend to review more content. So that metric of habituation is still very real for our team and for our newsroom, even though we are not looking at, say, trying to drive 5 or 6 article views, because then you're going to get hit by a paywall, you're going to get cut off from access, and then the consumer is forced to make that decision. We don't have that same value exchange, but we are trying to push re-engagement and build products and services around those more loyal, sustained habits. So newsletters for us, in the same way that you see at the Times, the Journal, the Post, the Atlantic, it's a big driver for that depth of engagement, relationship development. And it's why my team more recently has dug into newsletters across the NBC News digital portfolio. And we are very much in the middle of a project evaluating, well, how do we scale this out? If you have folks like the New York Times just 2 weeks ago is taking a number of theirs behind their subscription paywall because they see great value in that being an exchange, part of the call to action, subscribe and get access to these exclusive newsletters. We don't have that, but we do think that there is a way for us to incentivize people to sign up for those products, to download the app, because they are just a better experience. They are more intimate, they are more involved, and we have an opportunity to be more in depth in those areas that, say, we don't have that flexibility in 140, 80 characters on Twitter or in social copy for Facebook. Those are important drivers of reach and scale. But then when we talk about the value of those consumers, it really is still about those same engagement metrics of retained behavior, of viewership over time. And so it's been an easier transition for me, even though like the last 8 years, I was focused more on subscription products. It's the same playbook. It's just thinking about some of those metrics are a little different, and the scale of the operation is obviously just a bit bigger.
Right. Okay. Thank you. And speaking of the scale and the size of NBC and all the work you're trying to do, and you mentioned teams and working closely with your teams. Clearly, you're not in the office right now. So how do you and your team work together with the pandemic? How has that changed? I mean, you came in during the pandemic, and how do you see it going forward? Is everyone going to be back in the office soon, or is it going to be kind of remote, hybrid, or what is NBC planning, and how are you planning to work with your team that way?
So we are still evaluating when our return to office is going to be. Like many folks with Delta, there was a reevaluation with our time frame, which was supposed to be after Labor Day, like many other newsrooms. That has since been pushed back. What we do know is that when the return to office happens, and I'm one of those folks that is eager to go back in. I enjoy people. Not that I don't love being here with my sick child and my ornery cat. My wife is lovely. She's a great lunch date. But I like the interaction that happens in a newsroom when you have people that are sitting in proximity, that there's a certain kismet that takes place when you think about strategy and distribution and audience development as a practice. I think benefits from having a certain interaction of people with your audiences. But when we do go back, I expect it will be it's going to be a hybrid model, and I think that we have a lot of benefit to that, where remote work in general has forced a lot of change, a lot of shift to digital that was already underway. And I would say personnel-wise, for us, it's been actually a really great impetus to be pushing forward, following, again, the discussions around racial equality and equity. It's forced a lot of teams to move and advance those initiatives that much faster, because opening up the talent pool to remote candidates forces certain teams to look at the broadest swath of candidates, and you're no longer just looking at up here in New York a certain type of candidate. I am, a reflection of that, being a white male, that I'm very grateful that I've had a chance in the last year to speak with more candidates that are coming from a broader range of backgrounds. It makes our teams better. It makes the work better. And I expect that that's going to be something that hopefully continues as we, again, push for greater equity, equality, representation in newsrooms. That this is one of those, again, silver linings, I think, to the last year.
That's great. Thank you. what about like the tools, whether at NBC or the Atlantic? Like, we as a company and most companies rely heavily on Slack. But there are some outliers in the company that just wouldn't use it. But once we went fully remote, now that's our main form of communication. Are there any tools either here or at Atlantic that you use or that you rely on more than you did? And how do you see that going forward?
The Slack is a tool it is so ingrained now in the newsroom. It's strange to think about how we got anything done without it before.
Right.
I have been a slower convert on a day-to-day since I'm not old school, but I do enjoy the ability to do deep work. I think that's incredibly important. And I often joke that Slack is like the never-ending meeting without an agenda. It's great and it's fantastic, I think, when you are trying to make decisions or get quick feedback, but it's a challenge that you are always on. And talking of just being open, we've had some team members, both here and formerly at the Atlantic, have had challenges of being always on, and burnout within
Right.
journalism is very real. There is a lot of discussion around it. And I'm glad that, especially at NBC, we have been pushing on people to take vacation time, to push personal time. It's something as a manager, I'm very mindful of, how long has it been since the last PTO day that you took? And we need to keep talking about that. Again, I hope that's something that we continue after the pandemic subsides and we all go back to the office, that we need to be more in touch with our team members. And Slack is a great way to keep in that day-to-day conversation. But I'm hoping that we also allow people to do more deep work time. And we do find ways that I've started to encourage folks, block off chunks, big hours in your afternoons to get stuff done,
Right.
because there is a tendency to schedule over your lunch, schedule into the evening. I have a 13-month-old. It has been the greatest excuse opportunity for me to stop having meetings after 5:30. And I say, gotta go get the kid, gotta go make dinner. I'll sign on later, but just make sure that what we need to get done, we take care of within the day. It's been a reevaluation, and as a tool, as a practice, time management has been something I've worked on that I think we need to continue to talk about. I don't know if that was more of a personal question than what you were looking for, but
No, that
Slack
was
is great, Zoom is great, time management is great, block your calendar.
That's right. Well, so that was good because all of our clients are kind of going through, not just our clients, I mean, the entire world is going through, how do they kind of face and deal with these new realities, being at home with kids, using technology maybe they didn't use prior to working remote. But what about your audience? Like, how have you seen that change? As you're developing the audience and you're growing the audience, have you, aside from the news cycle and finding the stories that are, whatever's in the news cycle, have you found the viewership to be different now than the way you looked at them in, say, 2019?
Oh my gosh, yes. I mean, and this is again where we see very public numbers in the last 8-9 months following January and the violent insurrection, January 6th. That was a peak in 2021. And since then, news publishers have been seeing a bit of a decline in terms of reach, in terms of engagement. It is not the quality of the journalism, it's the anxiety, exhaustion that people have had over the last year. And it's not any one news publisher. You can look at ComScore numbers, you can look in CrowdTangle and Facebook numbers and see that there is a shift taking place in consumer behavior. And that should be expected.
Right.
I can say that I was signed up for 20 different news services throughout 2020. I have stopped getting as many push alerts. It's better for my health. And if I'm doing it, we have to expect that the average news consumer is also in that same mindset of thinking, do I need to read as much of the doom scroll news as I had before? No. So what that challenges us as publishers, journalists, strategists to do is reevaluate, well, it's not that people are not reading, consuming, because that is another trend, that people are more online now than ever before. But what are they engaging with? Well, yes, they're definitely consuming more Netflix, more Hulu, more NBC News Now digital. And we're trying to figure out, how do you program around the different consumer behaviors, the different needs. We're in the middle of a project right now with my NBC News colleagues, trying to evaluate, well, what are the subjects, what are the topics that people are most engaged with over time? How are we seeing, say, our politics coverage around national security, for instance? How does that compare to our coverage around racial equity, inequality? And how is that coverage bringing more people back for longer sessions, longer read times? And if we can think about doing those types of projects, digging a little bit more beyond just page views, sessions, users, and understanding, well, what are the areas of our coverage that are most likely to bring people back over time? Those are the areas of investment that we're trying to make a case to continue to dig into. And this is a lot of what news teams were doing prior to the election, when thinking about what are the areas of coverage that people are most likely to pay for. I did these types of projects when I was at the Times and the Atlantic, and there's a difference in the types of stories that draw in huge audiences, and then the types of stories that draw in smaller but more engaged, more loyal audiences. And so for us, and this is, again, I would encourage every team to use your SocialFlow data to dig into what are those posts that are of a certain nature, the explanatory, the service journalism, the more I would say the pieces that are less breaking or urgent and have more dwell time. Are those the types of things that we can pivot more resources to and make those investments so that we can address these changing consumer behaviors in the last year?
That's great. That's great. Thank you. And thank you for the plug. So I know that obviously you work with us on Facebook and Twitter, but I also know we've had some conversations in the past. The app is very important for you. Is there? Can you talk a little bit about that? Like, how are you? What is the main focus of the app? Is it engagement? Do you find that they're the more valuable reader? And how is that different in terms of content and strategy versus the browser reader, when somebody comes to the browser?
So all of it, the strategy is oriented around that product being more engaging. It attracts a more loyal audience. It is a more valuable readership in terms of average revenue per user. But it's the best, we'd argue, the best representation of the storytelling that we can produce, because it affords us a chance to not just get you to read one piece, but also highlight the breadth of the coverage that we produce. And not just for NBC News, but we have MSNBC, we have today.com and CNBC. In the app, we are moving to highlighting all of those brands and creating contextual ties between our different newsrooms, so that if you're reading a story about the latest pop culture, if there's something that comes up that is more today.com focused, how do we draw in, say, our MSNBC opinion-oriented coverage to highlight, well, what does this mean to me? How does this represent a larger connection to societal trends. And what we're eager to do is create those connections because frankly, it gives people more of the news that we know that they might be going to in other avenues, other publishers. And so if we do a better job of exposing them to the whole coverage that we produce, they might not feel the need to go elsewhere if they think that we don't do opinion pieces or we don't do more editorially driven enterprise storytelling. We do it all. The challenge for us is how do you represent that when for the majority of consumers, and this is for most publishers, SEO and search-oriented results are one of the biggest drivers of traffic. Well, when you get somebody into your AMP page, which is a very large chunk of the mobile readership that we have from search traffic, AMP, beautiful, wonderful reading experience, not very good at highlighting the full contextualization of a publisher. That's not what it was produced to do. AMP as a format has you go in, you read one story, you move on.
Right.
With the app, we have more opportunities to represent other stories and other areas of our coverage. And so that's why us, like so many other publishers, are deeply invested into making the app the best possible user experience that we have. We have work to do there. We have new products, adjacencies that we're adding as features. We just added into the NBC News app local. And so from some of our affiliate stations throughout the country. So if you put in your zip code, you'll now be able to get local coverage from your New Orleans affiliate station, which would be from my belief that local for us is a differentiator from some of the other national publishers. They don't have local coverage, but we know local coverage is so valuable and relevant to individual consumers. And we're finding more ways in which we can draw people into that. And again, that's very unique to us in the app, and it's why that's a feature that we're adding. We're also looking at our video coverage, and video for us, again, is a big differentiator. We have national broadcasts every day that go out to millions of consumers that other publishers don't have. The app is able to draw in that content as well as the stuff that we're producing for web. And we can pull those two experiences together so you get the full experience of what we produce in text and video and audio.
That's excellent. Thank you. That's great. So last question, as you're looking at 2022 and beyond, the app obviously is a big focus of your day. What do you see on the horizon? Like, what's exciting for you and your team? Are we going to see a big TikTok push, or what's exciting for NBC and for you?
So we are on TikTok, and we are one of the bigger publishers, especially our Today presence there. You go on, and Al Roker is an especially good follow if you haven't already taken a look at what we're producing there. I do think that we're going to continue to see more platforms open up as opportunities to connect with younger audiences. That is a big push for us in the next couple of years, making sure that we are diversifying our audience, but that requires us to diversify the type of coverage that we produce. We need to be bringing in younger voices and representation from different community, different ethnicities, backgrounds, because that is the makeup of the country, the audience that we're intending to reach. So we need to make sure that we're continuing to diversify internally, and it's great. NBC has a very big initiative around this, and I'm excited to be part of a company that's making an earnest and very real investment into thinking about the future and getting better at that. With the storytelling that we do, I feel that we have just outstanding journalists, and this was a newsroom that I respected before I had an opportunity to work here. But looking at the enterprise storytelling and getting into this this discussion around differentiation, because we have as everybody knows, there is so much news out there. There is so much to consume, and it can feel overwhelming when you have breaking news alerts for the same story coming from 20 different publishers. That's important. But what, and this is something that came out with my team at The Atlantic, the stuff that makes you stand out, the stuff that is unique and differentiated to your newsroom, is the stuff that people are going to associate with you, come back for, pay for. And the coverage is, I would say, even more important than the packaging or the venue for that. So TikTok's great. TikTok is an outstanding place for doing a new type of storytelling, but it comes back to the journalists that you hire, the stories that they tell, and making sure that those are unique, distinct, and aligned with the audiences that you want to reach. And that is why you saw so many newsrooms that did see success in 2020, because they invested in the storytelling that needed to take place around the pandemic, around the racial justice movement, and the 2020 election. The newsrooms that were not newsrooms, but the operations that were more commodified, that didn't have that opportunity, those were the ones that had to scale back. And so I think that this is going to continue to be the movement when trust in news is still very much in a place where there's seen a lot of fluctuation. Fortunately, the pandemic reinforced that trust in the news organizations that have a quality commitment. And so I'm grateful to work in places where that wasn't a question, but you do see that that is something that consumers are now starting to bring to their news consumption habits. And so making sure that we're focused on the topics, those news cycles that have, it's not about just getting it out there faster. It's about making it relevant to those consumers in a way that perhaps wasn't always the necessity in the last couple of years, but I think is going to be even more so of a focus, because niche publishers, more specialized publishers, you've seen in the last couple of years make a very big presence and build great business models out of. And the reason is that they can make that content more relevant, more valuable to individuals, instead of these big catch-all projects that, you speak to a lot of people, but doesn't actually speak to those communities or those individuals. Right. And so I'm excited to be in a newsroom where we are making those investments across the different verticals where we have with our Latinx coverage, with our NBC BLK coverage, and with a lot of our enterprise storytelling. That's where I think we're going to see a lot of great growth in the next year, a couple of years.
Excellent. Well, Bryan Davis, thank you for joining us today. This was very informative and excellent. Thank you.
Shannon, I appreciate the opportunity, and looking forward to chatting through this all in the next couple of months. Hopefully next year we'll be in an even better place and doing this in person, hopefully.
That's right. Hopefully. Thank you.
Thank you.